raise the flag of our nation and recognize the principles for which it stands. Department 1 is now in session. Honorable Mark B. Window, Judge, presiding.
Please be seated, everyone. Good morning. All right, all of our jurors are present in People versus Robert Durst. My apologies. The lawyers are all here on time, and we did not have legal issues that delayed us, but there are some logistics involved in this operation that slowed us down today. So we're working out the bugs, and we should have been able to start at 9. We'll keep at it so that you don't have to wait too long. So Mr. Durst is present. Mr. DeGuerin, you wish again to introduce your team?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Good morning. Let me introduce everybody quickly again. I'm Dick DeGuerin. I'm from Texas. I don't have an accent. At least I don't think I do. Everybody out here thinks I do. This is David Chesnoff. He's my co-counsel, along with Donald Ray from here, and Chip Lewis is.
I'm over here, Your Honor.
Thank you for that. Lauren Childress is going to be assisting us here today. She's a lawyer from Houston. And the last time we were here, she was very obviously pregnant. She's had her twin girls. And she'll be coming back and forth during the trial because of her responsibilities to her kids.
Mr. DeGuerin, I did want you to introduce your team and go into your opening. I wanted also the record to reflect that Mr. Lewin is present along with Mr. Balian and Mr. Milius, Mr. Miata, Mr. Henderson, joined today by the investigating officer, Detective
Luis Romero.
Detective Romero. I got you, Mr. Balian, didn't I?
No, yeah, I was just going to say Detective Shamlian has retired. He'll be coming back periodically when it's pertinent, but Detective Romero is now the investigating officer. He's been on the case from the beginning as well.
All right. Then with that, did you want to? You ready to launch into that? I had a little bit that I could save till later if you're ready.
I'm ready to go if we can go straight through.
Why don't we just go straight through? And I have there are other things I could save. So it's now time for the defense opening. I'll remind you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that opening statements are not evidence. What the lawyers say is not evidence. It's what they expect the evidence will show. I admonished you before Mr. Lewin's speech, and now before Mr. DeGuerin and I believe Mr. Chesnoff will their speech to you. Go ahead.
A lot of things have happened in the last 14 months. And so we have the opportunity to once again tell you what we think the evidence will show and what we think the evidence has already shown to some extent. You know, it's a different world we live in now, and we've all been affected by it in some way. If you were born in late March or April or early May, you've had 2 birthdays since we were last together. Think of that. What I want to do first is talk to you about what you've heard me say before and what I will say again. Bob Durst did not kill Susan Berman, and he doesn't know who did. The evidence, the lack of evidence, is what we will be talking about. Both the evidence and the lack of evidence. Another thing I want to say and repeat, and this goes to the evidence, Bob Durst had no motive and nothing to gain by the death of Susan Berman. Here's what I mean about that. Watch very carefully. First, Mr. Lewin has made a fine presentation, very skillful, very slick. Mine's not going to be that slick. But I will say this. The essence of the prosecution's theory of the evidence is that Susan Berman called the medical school and pretended she was Kathie Durst, and that was an alibi for Bob Durst. Evidence will show that Dean Cooperman got the call from who he for 35 years believed was Kathie on the morning of February the 1st. The evidence will also show, beyond any argument, that Kathie Durst and Bob Durst were in South Salem, Westchester County, New York, on the evening of January 31st. So there was a small window of time between the evening of January 31st and the morning of February 1st when Dean Cooperman got the call. And the evidence, there is no evidence that Bob Durst talked to Susan Berman in that window of time. The first evidence of any contact between Bob Durst and Susan Berman will come on about February the 6th, after the call to Dean Cooperman. So let's talk about what we know. There's 4 principal characters in this long 40-year story. A lot of what I say about the evidence is going to be very similar to what Mr. Lewin has said about the evidence and what the evidence will be, because in these 40 years, we have agreed on much of what the evidence is, what people will say. Whether it's correct or not depends on you. That's your duty, as the judge has told you. And another thing that the judge told you yesterday and reminded you of after 14 months is that 3 principles govern criminal cases. It's a presumption of innocence. Every person is presumed to be innocent, unless and until the burden of proof being on the prosecution proves beyond a reasonable doubt the guilt of the defendant. Presumption of innocence. The burden of proof always on the prosecution, and the quantum of proof being beyond a reasonable doubt. This is not a process of elimination. The evidence must convince you. And if it doesn't, you're not left to speculate. A speculation would be, if it wasn't Bob Durst, who was it? That's not your duty.
This sounds like argument.
It is starting to sound like argument. So the evidence you expect that will be presented during the trial.
We expect the evidence to raise a question that the judge tells you is not to be answered by you by speculation. So here are the 4 main characters. As I said, in 40 years, much of the evidence, such as photographs and so forth, belonged to both sides. You've seen this picture before. This is a picture of Bob Durst, Susan Berman in the middle, and Kathie Durst on the right. I believe this was taken at a book party that Bob threw for Susan when her book, which was wildly successful, came out. Bob and Susan and Kathie were good friends, close friends. And the fourth personality, the fourth person in this case, is Morris Black. Only Bob Durst ever knew Morris Black. None of the other two knew Morris Black. We'll talk about what the evidence will show the reason for Morris Black being in this case at all is. And the judge will give you instructions at the end of the case about how to consider any evidence about Morris Black. But before we get to Morris Black, I want to talk about who Bob Durst is also. There are two views. We have the prosecution, we have the defense. There are two views of what the evidence will show about Bob Durst. Some of it is agreed. Bob Durst was the son of Seymour Durst. That's Seymour on the right side of the screen, and that's the cover of a New York magazine, not the New Yorker. There's a big difference. Susan worked for New York magazine for a short period of time, wrote for them. It's more of a I don't want to say scandal sheet, but it's not the literary magazine that the New Yorker is. On the left is a cover of the New York magazine that shows back in, I think that was 1980, May of 1980, if you can read that date, that cover. Seymour Durst is at the lower right of that photograph. You might notice a familiar face in the upper left of the photograph. I think that fellow had a national office until just recently. You don't choose your family. Bob was one of 4 siblings. In the picture on the right, Bob is standing in the background. Wendy, his sister, is to the right. Douglas, his immediately younger brother, is sitting with a striped shirt. And that's Tommy, who you've heard from. It was a dysfunctional family. By any stretch of the imagination, Bob's mother either jumped or fell to her death. Bob was there when it happened, when he was a young child. And after that, he was raised by nannies and governesses. His father was absent in New York most of the time. And the family, the siblings were dysfunctional. In fact, as you have, I don't know why that's blinking on and off. Does anybody know what's wrong with this screen?
This one?
Yeah, it seems to be blinking. May I stop for a moment, Judge? Still, no, it's blinking still. I don't think the other screens are.
We have the A-team on it now, Your Honor. The
Yeah.
A-team is sitting down.
If that's the A team, I'd be on the D team.
Probably lower in the alphabet, Dick, John.
Thank you, John.
I think we're okay.
Okay, You know, Aggie engineering is to go over and give it a Swiss kick. All right. You've heard from Tommy. Tommy, at age 60-something, maybe he's almost 70 now, still resents Bob. The evidence is he still hates Bob for trapping him in a revolving door. Now, that was the evidence that you've heard, or some of it. And you will see that this family didn't like each other. In all that, by the way, that may be the only picture where the four siblings appear happy.
Is that screen working now?
It seems to be working now.
Okay, thank you.
Bob went on to high school. He went to Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and then he went to UCLA. We're jumping forward quite a bit. Lehigh's in Pennsylvania, coincidentally or not. That's where Bob was arrested when he went on the lam from Galveston, a place where he had been happy, a place he returned to when he was on the lam and afraid of dying or being put in prison forever. That's where he met Susan Berman. He and Susan Berman shared an unhappy childhood after her parents died and after his mother died. And they had that in common, and they hit it off as friends. Friends. Close friends. Friends all their life. Never lovers. Friends. So, what about Susan Berman? I'm going to go into her much later, but we know, and it's undisputed, that Bob and Susan remained friends throughout the years. In 1970 or thereabouts, Bob met Kathie. Kathie, who is Kathie Durst? Kathie was from a family in Long Island. You've heard one of her sisters appear already. You heard her brother appear already. They've lost their sister. I want to recall to you some of the evidence that you heard from Kathie's sister. You remember when she testified, I brought out something about her accent. Now, and I tried to do it in a friendly way. I said, I don't think I have an accent, but obviously you speak in what I would term a Long Island accent. And she said yes. And I asked, well, did Kathie speak that way also? She said yes. There will be evidence that Dean Cooperman saw nothing unusual in Kathie's accent and did not, and you will also hear evidence that Susan Berman had a strong accent, and it wasn't a Long Island accent. We believe the evidence will convince you that Susan Berman didn't make that call, and thus there was nothing that Bob Durst did to cause Susan Berman to make the call. So who's Kathie? She and Bob married on Bob's birthday. They were very happy. There was an age difference, not a great age difference in today's world. They came from different backgrounds. Bob came from money. Kathie came from an ordinary, working class, happy, big Irish family from Long Island. But they were happy. They were happy in Vermont, where Bob and Kathie moved and started a health food store. Bob didn't like being in the Durst organization. He didn't like the type of work that they did, the real estate, the collecting rents, and sometimes not so good parts of town. And he and Kathie had this health food store. It was called All Good Things, which, if you remember, one of the days of our trial, you'll see the movie, which is a movie, and it's imaginary, called All Good Things, and that's what the producers, Andrew Jarecki and two of his cohorts, produced as an imaginary story of Bob Durst. Here's another picture of Kathie and Bob. It's probably taken at the same party that Bob had. There's another one. You can tell kind of by the collar that Kathie has on her shirt or on her jacket. You can kind of tell by Bob's tie. It's the same picture or same time as that one. And so they were friends. They were friends in New York. Kathie, doing it again. Kathie went to nursing school, and from there was encouraged to go to medical school. She applied to maybe a dozen different medical schools. The only ones that she was able to get into was Einstein. Now, I say the only one. That doesn't mean that it's not a good medical school. In fact, it's an excellent medical school with an excellent reputation. The evidence will show. And some of the founders of Einstein were the Durst family. The evidence will show that Bob helped Kathie go to medical school. He was proud of her being in medical school. Where do they live? Bob and Kathie had a cottage, a very nice, small cottage on a small private lake in Westchester County. We call it the South Salem home. You'll hear it called that. That's the evidence. Mr. Lewin was incorrect about his statement of the evidence of the sequence of living places. After they got the South Salem home, they got South Salem home in like 97 or 98. Excuse me, 77 or 78. And then they got an apartment on 86th Street. East 86th Street in New York is on the east side of Central Park. If you know anything about New York, it's a very nice address. It's the upper 80s in New York talk. It's probably a block or so from Central Park. Later, they got the Riverside Drive apartment. The Riverside Drive apartment's on the other side of Manhattan, on the Hudson River. Now, Kathie's in medical school, and the evidence will show that she had trouble in medical school. The evidence will show not that Kathie wasn't smart, but that Kathie had a drug problem. Her friends will say that. Her family will say that. They were worried about her. She used cocaine. And this was in the early 80s, late 70s. And she started having trouble in medical school. Here's part of her medical school record. It's hard to read there, so we'll blow it up a little bit. Here's what it says. It's an evaluation. Mrs. Durst was unable to attend a large part of the clerkship, mostly due to ill health. There will be no evidence that Kathie had ill health. There will be evidence that she used cocaine. Continuing with the quote, so I have suggested to her that she should repeat the entire clerkship at a suitable time. I'm also disappointed at her lack of responsibility in not returning the books she borrowed from our library in spite of repeated reminders. She was having such difficulty that the assistant dean, Jean Cook, wrote her a personal note. This is very important because it shows that there was a relationship between Kathie and the assistant dean. I don't mean relationship in the terminology that might have been something improper at all. Please don't misinterpret that. But there was a relationship. Surely the evidence is that Dean Cook, as well as Dean Cooperman, who was the dean, knew that the Durst family were founders of the school, and they took a special interest in Kathie. And so here on the 9th of March, 1981, Kathie's having problems, and Dean Cook writes her, I understand from my office that things aren't going too smoothly for you right now. What would you like? Would you like to talk to me? Do you think I can help? Sincerely. The next day, Dean Cook writes to the registrar and says that she's withdrawn from her surgery clerkship for personal reasons. Now, Dean Cook's dead, so we can't bring him here to testify. But from this evidence, you can see Dean Cook wrote her on March the 9th. Dean Cook wrote the registrar on March the 10th, dropping her from one of her classes or one of her clerkship. At the same time, Bob and Kathie's relationship began to fall apart. Bob didn't want kids, Kathie did. Kathie was using cocaine. Bob used marijuana. On March the 17th, Bob wrote a letter to Kathie, and it was as friendly a letter as it can be when you're moving out. It's a little hard to read, but it's a letter to Kathie dated March 17th, right in the middle of when she was having these problems at school, saying that he would move out of East 86th Street. That was their only apartment in the city at the time. And it said that he'd like a couple of things, his clothes and some furniture that came from his family. And otherwise, he wanted to have this settled as soon as possible. There's a copy to his lawyer. Signed, Bob. It's not threatening. It's not anything more than trouble between a couple that once were happy with each other. And what we know the evidence will show is that Kathie's difficulties in school continued. Here's another record from her record, July of 1981. It reminds her of her radiology clerkship that she started, was never completed. Very important, because later when she calls Dean Cooperman, she actually called Dean Cook, and the call was forwarded to Dean Cooperman. She talks about having to make up that clinic.
That misstates the evidence, Your Honor.
The attorneys are stating what they believe the evidence will show. You're the judges of the evidence. You may continue, Mr. DeGuerin.
We believe that's what the evidence will show. I'm going to show you a couple of others. Pieces of record from her files. Again, in July of 1981, an evaluation, and we'll blow this up so you can read it a little bit better. Kathleen unfortunately had an illness in her family and was unable to complete the clerkship. Now, this clerkship is the neurology clerkship. Remember, she couldn't complete the radiology clerkship, and now it's the neurology clerkship. She plans to make up the missing period later in the year. The evidence will show that there was no illness in her family. Or maybe I should put it this way. There will be no evidence of illness in her family that caused her to have these problems. In approximately Labor Day of 1981, Bob and Kathie moved back together to make a go of it. That's when they got the penthouse apartment on Riverside Drive. That's a picture of it. The Riverside Drive apartment was very nice. The East 86th Street apartment was nice, but it wasn't anything like the Riverside Drive apartment. This was a penthouse. It had a terrace. It shared that floor, that penthouse floor, with one other person, the Andersons. You've seen that lady here. And there was a terrace that surrounded the entire place. They moved in there. And then what we believe the evidence will show is that on February 1st, Kathie disappeared. Why do we say February 1st? On February 1st, Kathie called the medical school. The call went to Dean Cook's office, but he was out of town, and so the call was routed to Dean Cooperman. Dean Cooperman was expecting the call. Dr. Cook told him to expect the call, or to expect a call from Kathie. The evidence is she described what was going on with her. She described her illness. She described the clerkship that she was going to have to miss.
That misstates the evidence, Your Honor.
So when the lawyers are arguing, I will correct them when they misstate the evidence. Here, we haven't heard the evidence. This is what Mr. DeGuerin believes the evidence will show, and if he's not correct, then it will be pointed out. But right now, keep in mind that the statements of the attorneys are not evidence. You may proceed.
Let me clear that up right now. Jumping forward, Mike Struck, the detective that was assigned to the case, interviewed Dean Cooperman, and Dean Cooperman described the call as describing Kathie's problem in a clerkship in neurology. Now,
Your Honor, this is a hearsay document, which
Is this
document that counsel has.
okay, you don't expect this to be proved.
I'm sorry, Your Honor?
He doesn't expect this to be proved, is what you're telling me. You're telling me he's not expecting to present this evidence.
He can't present this evidence.
well,
Then don't.
It was presented in Mike Struck's testimony, Your Honor.
That is, and which we've already had a stipulation regarding that testimony.
Okay.
This is not included. In addition, Dean
Okay.
Cooperman has already
Okay,
testified that it's
stop,
a different.
Stop.
Well.
Stop. No speaking objection. You're not going to show a document now, right?
No, sir.
Your Honor, can the jury please be instructed to disregard the document they've seen?
Was there a
He
document?
put it up. Yeah, he had a,
All right.
a police report in the.
Judge, that came in Mike Struck's testimony.
His testimony was a conditional examination. It
All
was
right,
not
all
evidence.
right. So there's an objection. The hearsay evidence is not admissible, with exceptions. So I've made rulings about evidence. Some evidence is not not reliable. I've excluded anything that's unreliable for reasons that have been argued to me already. So the lawyers are going to tell you what they expect the evidence will show, and constrain yourself, Mr. DeGuerin. Please present only what the evidence will show, what you know it will show, and leave out anything that it will not show. Go ahead.
Dean Cooperman took the call. He took the call because Dean Cook was not there. Dean Cook had a relationship with Kathie. As we've seen, Dean Cook reached out to her when she was having trouble. Dean Cook helped her. Dean Cook was the natural person for Kathie to call. You're going to hear evidence from other medical students who did not have that kind of relationship with Dean Cook or Dean Cooperman, who will say, well, it'd be unusual to call the dean if you're going to be absent. But they didn't have that kind of relationship. And the evidence will show you that Kathie did have that kind of relationship, and most likely was a product of the fact that the Durst family were founders of the school.
That's an argument. I'm sorry.
Well, the Durst family were founders of the school. That's evidence. That
Right.
would be evidence.
Okay, Mr. DeGuerin, you may state they're founders of the school. You may state the other thing you said, but you may not state because of this you should believe that. That is the essence of an argument. Do not argue to the jury. You may proceed with the evidence that they expect to see. They should expect to see.
For 35 years, Dean Cooperman believed that he heard from Kathie Durst that morning, that Kathie Durst was on the phone call, that the details that she imparted to him about her clerkship, about her illnesses, came from Kathie Durst. The information about the clerkship, the evidence will show, wasn't known other than by Kathie and her medical students. Bob didn't know what her clerkships were. And more importantly, as the evidence will show, there was no communication between Bob Durst and Susan Berman any time around that phone call. Before that phone call, there was no way for Bob Durst to ask Susan Berman, because there's no evidence. There's no evidence of any contact between Bob Durst and Susan Berman before that phone call. The evidence will show the first contact between Susan Berman and Bob Durst came about 5 days later. So Bob reported Kathie missing to the NYPD, Detective Struck. An investigation began. Because of the passage of time and because of the fact that people have died, we cannot bring you any evidence about what Detective Struck found. But what we do know is that Bob reported her missing and placed a $100,000 reward. I think yesterday Mr. Lewin put up a slide that said it was a $15,000 reward. Here's the...
That misstates the evidence, Your Honor.
Okay, well, that's not evidence. It's a reference to what you said. But what you may... so overall...
39 years ago, $100,000, it's a lot today, but it was even more almost 40 years ago. Bob's going to testify. I've already told you that. Bob was encouraged that the police were doing a good job. The investigation stalled or fizzled or didn't go anywhere, but the evidence will show there was no evidence that Kathie Durst was murdered. No evidence. Now, remember about the burden of proof and who it's on. It's the burden of the prosecution to prove it. That's their case. It's not a question of what happened to Kathie Durst. It's a question of whether the prosecution has proved it to you beyond a reasonable doubt. There was a search at South Salem. Nothing found. There was a search at the apartment. The evidence is that there was no evidence about Kathie Durst. There was no blood, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon of any kind. It was and is a mystery. In 1990s, Bob left the Durst organization. What happened here? Oh, there we go. He wasn't happy with it anyway. You'll hear some evidence about some disrespect that he had for the organization and for his brother and so forth. And Seymour, the father, chose Douglas, the second oldest brother, to run the Durst organization, which he does to this day. We're told that Douglas Durst will be here to testify. And I think it will be the evidence clear that Douglas Durst hates his brother. Bob left and he moved to California. Bob and Susan remained close. And when Bob moved to California, Susan eventually moved there also from New York. She had great success with her book, and she was very successful at first in California. So let's talk a little bit more about Susan Berman. Here's a picture of Susan with her father, David Berman. Davy the Jew was his nickname in mob parlance. He took over the one of the casinos from Bugsy Siegel when Bugsy Siegel was murdered. There's a lot more about his history, but it really doesn't matter. He died when Susan was young. And so with Bob and Susan having a similar background, both the child of dynamic parents and both losing their parents at an early age. Bob losing his father because his father became an absentee father, and his mother dying in a fall from her house, and Susan losing her parents when she was young. Susan was a very talented writer. She had made some bad decisions. The evidence will show that she aligned herself with some people that took her for her money. She first lived in the house in which she died, moved to a much nicer house on, I think it's Coin, and but lost the money in bad investments and had to move back to Benedict Canyon. Along the way, Bob and she remained close. Bob even walked her down the aisle and gave her away in her one wedding. The wedding turned out to be a disaster. The marriage was, at least, and it didn't last very long. All along, Susan was trying to make a living writing. But Bob and Susan remained close. In fact, at about the time of her death, the time of her death, Bob bought a triplex on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. That's just the Golden Gate Bridge. It's not a picture of the place. Bob planned for the place to be remodeled. The evidence will show Susan was to live in the first floor. She had phobias about the second floor of any place. She had phobias about going over a bridge. She had lots of phobias, a lot of neuroses. The evidence will show all of her friends talked about Susan's phobias and Susan's neuroses and Susan's fabulism, confabulism. And that's a 8-cylinder words meaning she made things up. She made her stories better. She embellished.
Sounds like argument.
The evidence will show from their witnesses that Susan told stories all the time. She told different stories to different people. Susan had financial problems. She borrowed or was given money from a number of friends, not just Bob Durst. This is a list that came off of Susan's computer, the evidence will show, after her death, and it lists different people who had given her different amounts of money. Bob had given her the most. I think that 9 millions plus 1,000 is just a joke. Bob had given her, actually Bob gave her more than the 50,000 that's listed here. Over the years, he would give her money from time to time because they were friends and she needed it. November the 9th, here's a check. It'll be in the evidence. It's a check to Susan Berman for $25,000. There was a letter that accompanied it, but on the back, something very telling. The evidence will show that when Susan endorsed the back of the check, she wrote Bob a note. You remember when you used to get your checks and your statements, and you actually had copies of the check or the checks themselves? Well, Bob, this is what she wrote on the back of the check. It says, "I love you, Bobby. Thank you so much. I'll pay every penny back soon." The evidence will show he didn't expect to get the money back. He expected it to be a gift. Now, to step aside just for a second and to talk about the relationship between Susan and Bob. Here's a letter. It's hard to read. We'll get it blown up in just a second. It's a letter. It's not dated, but we know by references in the letter it was years earlier. And Bob is suggesting that he was unhappy with his family Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays in New York, and he wanted to spend Christmas with her. He suggested that they go to a, here is the second page of it, he suggested that they go to a spa, La Costa, but she had some, the evidence will show she had some connections. You could get them a free room. I want to get us 2 rooms at La Costa or whatever spa you or resort you would like to go to, from a couple of days before Christmas to a couple after. 4 days, maybe a week, and I'll meet you there. Friends, good friends. And the evidence will show that not every year, but on a semi-regular basis, Bob and Susan would spend Christmas together. That's significant because, as we'll see in a moment, lots of people knew that Bob was coming to visit Susan in the Christmas season of 2000 when she was murdered. It wasn't a secret. Now, again, stepping aside just for a moment, in November of 2000, Janine Pirro, who was then the Westchester District Attorney, reopened an investigation of Kathie's disappearance. 20 years, almost 20 years, after 18 years, after Kathie disappeared. It was leaked to the media. And the media played it up, and it was awful. The evidence will show that the reinvestigation was based upon a bogus tip of a guy that was in jail and wanted out, whose wife had been a maid. Who's Janine Pirro? Is she someone to be feared? Well, the evidence will show that when this was going on, she was a brash, aggressive, loud, self-promoting politician. And the evidence will show it was easy for her to get publicity on Bob. The New York Daily News is one of the tabloids in New York. And, of course, there's a headline, Missing Durst Wife Case Reopened After 18 Years. The evidence will show that Bob Durst was advised that a prosecutor could get an indictment of a ham sandwich if they wanted to. And that Janine Pirro, as aggressive and so forth as she was fully capable of getting an indictment and putting him in jail. And what did he do? He ran. He ran, and we'll talk about where he ran and why he ran and how he ran in just a moment. He'd been running all his life. Kathie's disappearance was investigated again, but there was still no evidence. But fearful of this ambitious prosecutor, the evidence will show that she ran for Attorney General and lost New York. She's now, as I'm sure some of you know, a presence on Fox News. And Bob was scared. All his life he had run away. The evidence will show he ran away from school, he ran away from camp, he ran away from home. He was scared. And so, on November the 14th, he ran to Galveston, Texas. Bob doesn't make what we would consider good decisions, and one of the explanations you'll hear from a psychiatrist, Dr. Milton Altshuler. He's getting up in years too. Bob suffered from what has been known as Asperger's syndrome. It is on the autism scale, and is no longer called Asperger's, but for many years it was called Asperger's. It's a mild form of autism, and people can be functioning. There are famous people that recently have said they have Asperger's. And what it's characterized by is an inability to read social cues. Something that about someone with Asperger's is they're viewed by their contemporaries, their school chums, their people that know them, as a little weird. And Bob has been considered a little weird all his life. Explains a lot. So he ran to Galveston, Texas. Bob had had an apartment in Dallas, Texas for years, and he'd been to Galveston before, and as he will tell you when he testifies, Galveston seemed like a good place to hide. He wanted to hide. He wanted to hide from Janine Pirro, and he wanted to hide from the terrible press in New York City and having to see somebody who would look out of the corner of their eyes as if he were some freak. Galveston, Texas is literally at the end of the road. What's on the screen now is a closer map. There's Texas generally, and what's on the screen now is a closer map of Texas to show from Houston, Texas to Galveston, Texas, Interstate 45, it ends. It literally ends. Well, I suppose, depending on your outlook, maybe it begins there. But that's the end of the road. And Bob, to hide out, rented a cheap apartment in a rundown area of town, clean, but cheap, $300 a month. That's a picture of it. He rented that apartment dressed as a woman with a cheap wig and loose clothes, but he figured if he couldn't make that disguise work if he talked, because when Bob talks to you, as you'll see, he has a deep, gravelly voice with a New York accent. I've known Bob 20 years. That's about the best I can do. And so he decided he'd be a mute woman. Not a deaf woman, a mute woman. So he and Klaus Dillman, the owner of the apartment, communicated on a scratch pad, on a writing pad. Klaus Dillman would talk to him, and Bob, dressed as Dorothy Siner, by the way, Dorothy Siner was a girl in grade school that he had a crush on. And so he rented that apartment, and he moved in. And then almost the first week that he moved in, he had a run-in with Morris Black. his neighbor. You've seen the slide of Morris. Morris confronted him about leaving the lights on because Morris thought it was wrong, that it went on his light bill, but it didn't. Now, let's get back to Susan and Bob. We'll come back to Morris Black and what happened in Galveston after Susan Berman was murdered. Let's come back to Susan and Bob. They remained close throughout the years. They vacationed together. Here's another picture you've already seen of that letter that Bob wrote to Susan about spending Christmas together. So it was a normal thing for them to do together. December 23rd, Susan Berman's murdered. It was either on the night of December 22nd or the morning of December 23rd, and the medical examiner will not be able to pinpoint an exact time of death. But she went to the movies with her friend Robert Markey and left him off. I believe his testimony will be at about 10 or 10:30 that night. Bob did not try to hide that he came to California. He actually flew to California, to San Francisco, under his own name, and he visited where he had lived in Northern California to tie up some loose ends. And he was planning to go to Los Angeles to spend some time with Susan, and they together would drive back up in Bob's car to San Francisco to look at and work on the house that they would live in together, not as partners like we think it today, but Susan would have the bottom floor, Bob would have the top 2 floors. Work needed to be done with the lawyer and the architect that was planning that and getting the proper permits. So Susan and others were expecting Bob. Susan had talked to others. Bob got to Los Angeles, and he went to Susan's house. The front door was locked, nobody answered. He went around to the side, and the back door was open, and he went in and he found Susan's body. And he freaked out. The phone had been disconnected. And Bob left, but before he left and drove back up to San Francisco, he wrote a note, an anonymous note, and sent it to the Beverly Hills police. Now, Mr. Lewin, I think, inadvertently made a statement yesterday that the police got the letter before they found the body. That's not correct. They found the body first. You'll see when the letter was posted and so forth. And the Beverly Hills police was not, that was not the right place, because the address on Benedict Canyon is not in Beverly Hills. It's close, and it seems like it's Beverly Hills, but it's not. For years, he denied writing the note. It's so obvious, if you've ever seen Bob's handwriting, that that's Bob's handwriting. And so he'll tell you. I was afraid that she would lay there for days and nobody would find her, and so I wrote that note, I sent it to the police, and then I drove to San Francisco and flew back to New York under his name. There'll be no evidence. Well, later, at some point that morning, the neighbors see the dogs running loose. Unusual. And so they call the police, and by 1 o'clock, LAPD entered the house, and the police officer who entered the house is on the stand now and will be resuming today, I believe. They found the body. In the search and investigation at the house, we have the evidence will show that the search was not the best, but the evidence will show that the phone was unplugged. That's a picture of it. There's a closer picture of it. It was off the hook. The door where Susan's body was found has extensive paint chips on the floor. The door to the kitchen was wide open. Then what do we know about the investigation? What we know is the evidence is lacking. The evidence will show that there was not a fingerprint of Bob found. There was not a handprint. There was no DNA. There's no blood of Bob. There's no fibers from his clothes. There's no blood in his car. No gun. No shoe prints. There was nothing in his car when it was searched later. No fingernail scrapings were done on Susan. They also didn't do a sexual exam. So there is no evidence, no forensic evidence, none, that Bob Durst killed Susan Berman. Was she murdered? Yes. Who did it? That's not our burden. That's not your burden. The state's burden, the prosecution's burden, is to prove who did it beyond a reasonable doubt. And as I said in the beginning, it's not a process of elimination. It's not, if not Bob, who did it. It's, if not Bob, it's not guilty. In February of 2001, Susan's funeral, actually it was a service, was held here in Los Angeles. Bob flew from New York to Los Angeles under his name to attend the service. He's advised, however, not to go. But he did see Sarah Kaufman. Sarah Kaufman was the son of a lover of Susan's. And when Susan and Sarab's father broke up, Sarab and his sister stayed with Susan. The father, by the way, is the one who got Susan involved in a harebrained scheme to make a musical out of the Dreyfus affair. If you know anything about the Dreyfus affair, it's not very humorous, and it's not the subject of a musical, but the last of Susan's money went to promoting this harebrained scheme, and it caused her to have to move back to what was then a dump. And as you'll see from the photographs, she lived in it like it was a dump on Benedict Canyon. But Sarab Kaufman, Susan was close to Sarab, like her own son, the evidence will show. And Bob, when he came, but was advised not to actually go to the services because of the media being present, he and Sarab Kaufman got together. And Sarab gave Bob a memento from Susan that he believed Susan would want him to have. It was a medallion and chain that had belonged to Davy Berman, her beloved father. This wasn't something that was in the will. It was something that was done by Sarab Kaufman. There wasn't anything to be settled in the estate. She didn't have anything. Everything that she'd had gone. And that's why she had to rely on her friends for help. So, what else do we know about Susan? Her friends, all of her friends that will testify, will tell you that she was a fabulist. She made up stories. She was a writer. She had a great imagination. And she told different stories and embellished different stories to different people. She told lies day in and day out. The people will tell you. Let's see. Okay, there we go. She told Bob several times that she'd been contacted by the authorities. That was a lie. John Lewin told Bob, when he questioned Bob, that it was a lie.
I'm going to tell you something. That wasn't true. They had not contacted her. They were planning on contacting her. They had never contacted her.
That's a fact. That's the evidence. Although Susan told Bob from time to time that the authorities had contacted her, and Bob told Susan, talk to him. They had not contacted her. So even to her close friend, Bobby Durst, she told lies. Susan, her neurotic behavior will be described to you by her friends. She didn't like to be above a first floor of any building. She told lies about the authorities coming to see her. She told lies about calling the medical school. And here's what the evidence will show. That the many friends that she had, that she told these various stories, and you'll see that the evidence will show that the stories were different a little bit. Each story was different to her friends. None of these friends, none of them came forward to the authorities until Mr. Lewin and his crew came calling. The evidence will show that the evidence will be persuasive, at least, that a lot of these friends just didn't believe what Susan was telling them.
That's argument.
Because for 15 years, from Christmas of 2000 when Susan was killed until about 2014, that's really 13 years, isn't it? My math is not that good. After the Jinx producers came to Mr. Lewin and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office was when they first told their stories about what Susan had said. Once again, the doctor who knew Kathie spoke to her the day she called in sick. And Susan was a storyteller. She was hard to deal with. She made things up. Now, let's get back to Morris Black. The timeline is pretty simple. Kathie Durst disappeared without a trace in 2002. Susan Berman was murdered. I'm sorry. Susan Berman was murdered in 2001. Excuse me, 2000. Kathie disappeared 18 years earlier, also without a trace. Susan was murdered. There's not a trace of evidence that Bob did it. But with Morris Black, we readily and freely admit that the evidence will show that Morris Black died in a struggle with Bob Durst. The judge will instruct you on how to consider this evidence, understanding, of course, that the jury found Bob Durst not guilty of murder. You might be saying, well, isn't that double jeopardy? Well, what's going on here? The judge will instruct you about that, about the law of similar crimes. And basically the instruction will be that it's for you to decide.
You should not be instructing the jury.
Yeah, I'll
just-
leave it.
I'll be happy for the court to do it.
Yes, I will. Of course I will.
I meant now. Just to put it in context.
You can, I'll let you try, but I'm going to correct you if you get it wrong.
Okay.
I'm going to correct you anyway. This is your version of it. This is your short form, but you're treading on dangerous ground when you try to explain it. Of course, there's subtleties.
Well, the general principle, I think this is safe. The general principle is evidence of other crimes is admitted in order to help you to determine whether it's persuasive that the defendant did the crime under consideration, the Susan Berman murder, because of similarity.
So
The evidence will show.
That's, leave it to me, Mr. DeGuerin, to explain it. I'll explain it to the jury. In fact, I'll explain it early. We won't even wait till the end of the trial when instructions are given ordinarily. I will, contemporaneously with that evidence, explain the limitations on the use of that evidence and the positive uses of that evidence. You may discuss the facts.
Well, the facts will show and the evidence will show that they weren't similar at all. The facts will show that whereas Kathie Durst disappeared without a trace, and whereas Susan Berman was murdered in her own home and there's no forensic evidence, when Morris Black died, there was hundreds of pieces of evidence. And the facts will show that it's completely dissimilar. The judge will instruct you on how to consider that. Is that good enough?
It's not enough, but it's not entirely, it's not wrong. There's more to it, a lot more
Can I
to
say
it.
about the signature? It supposed to be so similar as to be the signature?
No, Mr. DeGuerin.
All
Let,
right.
let me do it, okay?
Granted.
Okay, thank you.
Morris Black. The evidence will show that Morris Black was a cantankerous, mean guy, and that Bob had reason to be afraid of him. They struck up a relationship. Remember, Bob suffered from, and does still, being on the scale of autism, what's known as Asperger's, or what was known as Asperger's, and it's characterized by an inability to read other people's moods, an inability to understand. And so Bob didn't see that. Bob quit wearing his disguise in Galveston not long after he rented the apartment. The evidence will show that Morris Black asked Bob, Bob was coming into the apartment, and Morris Black asked Bob, where's that woman that rented this apartment? And Bob said, well, she travels. And Bob came in and lived from time to time, not all the time, in that apartment. And soon after that, he dropped the disguise altogether. The evidence will show that there were several events that happened that were kind of humorous, actually. For one thing, he jogged. He was in a lot better shape back then than he is now. He jogged on a regular basis, and he didn't wear the wig when he jogged because it was too hot. He went to a bar once with the wig on, and as he leaned down for someone to light his cigarette, it was dark in the bar because Bob didn't make a very pretty woman, but somebody offered to light his cigarette, and the wig caught on fire, and Bob brushed it off, and there was a very shocked man on the bar stool next to him. And so he quit being Dorothy Siner. He went back to being Bob Durst, but just Bob Durst. And nobody knew who Bob Durst was in Galveston. As it turns out, and what Bob will tell you, Morris Black had an affinity for guns. He liked guns. Bob had a powerful handgun that he went out shooting with Morris Black, and Morris Black was very dangerous with it. Bob had bought the gun under his name, signed all the forms years earlier. And so Bob went to a gun shop on the mainland. Galveston's an island, and he went to a gun shop on the mainland and bought a .22 target pistol because it would be safer to go out and shoot with. And the evidence will show, Bob will tell you about it, they went out and shot that .22. But Morris had this affinity for guns. And Morris was a cantankerous guy. He was so cantankerous that he got a letter of basically an eviction notice. Klaus Dillman, the landlord, wrote him a letter saying, I'm not going to renew your lease. You have until so-and-so to get out. He got so mad, he showed that to Bob, and he took that eviction letter and put it up on the wall on the door frame in the Bob's apartment. Bob went into the bathroom, and he heard a gunshot. He came out, and Morris Black had shot at the eviction notice. Didn't hit it, but there was a hole in the wall. And last year, I showed you those pictures of the hole in the wall, and what happened was Bob got mad at Morris, took the gun away from him, took the key away from him, and Morris later repaired it. You'll see evidence of that. There was a bullet hole that went into a door frame. It went into further into the door frame. And an expert that we had found it because we knew where to look. But Morris Black repaired it by putting putty in there and repainting it. Another time, Morris Black shot the gun in the apartment. This time he shot it into some styrofoam that was from the television set that was in a closet. Bob said, "That's the final straw. Get out. Give me your key." Bob was in the process of moving out anyway. He would stay at the San Luis Hotel on the beach in Galveston, a very nice resort hotel. He stayed under his name. He used his credit card, used his driver's license. He was cashing checks on a regular basis at the bank, the branch bank of Bank of America, for $9,000 or $9,500 each on a regular basis. And he would, when he cashed the checks, he'd give his ID, Bob Durst. The account was Bob Durst. He was living openly as Bob Durst, but nobody cared in Galveston. Nobody knew who he was. Morris Black knew that his name was Bob Durst, and there's no evidence that Morris Black ever found out anything other than Bob seemed to have a lot of money. The evidence will show that at one point, Morris asked Bob to donate some money to the Jesse Tree, which is a charity that helps homeless people. And Bob went to test the owner of the Jesse Tree to see whether he truly was how his money would go, and he was not satisfied, and that was the end of that. But then one day, Bob had been staying.
Mr. DeGuerin, we need to take a break for our reporter. Is this? Do you need
Sure.
another minute, or can we do that now?
That's fine.
Then we will take a 15-minute break now, ladies and gentlemen. Do not talk about the case or any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until after you've discussed the case with the other jurors during deliberations. We'll see you at, where's the clock in here? 11, is that 11:15?